Hello there. The reason that I am making this video today is because somebody very special is actually having a birthday on this particular day, and that is Gino Vannelli. Uh, Basically, most people, such as myself, know him for two songs, and that is I Just Want to Stop from 1978 and Living Inside Myself, which was released in 1981, I believe. Now, I didn't find out about Gino Vannelli from reading somebody else's blog or from friends or however I normally learn about music. I found him out through a completely independent search on the web, YouTube, and whatever. This is why the internet is important for music, because of artists like Gino here. Um, Gino Vannelli was originally from Montreal, and the reason I'm doing this is because he is having a birthday today, actually. And the one thing that I love about Gino Vannelli, particularly in the 70s, is that he is, for all intents and purposes, the Italian-Canadian Stevie Wonder. He has the songwriting and orchestrating abilities of a Tin Pan Alley songwriter like Irving Berlin, David Foster, or even George Gershwin. And he blends jazz fusion, progressive pop rock music with that, along with a great deal of funk, soul, and gospel. He puts everything into it and creates this swelling sound, which is actually very much based in the electronics and synthesizers of the time. And his first album, apparently the record collecting community referred to such records as a grail, like a holy grail. And it was recorded for A&M in 1973, called Crazy Life. It didn't have any hits, so the album, well, there was the title song, which was fairly popular, but it wasn't a huge hit album, so the CD, vinyl, and cassette are all out of print and really, really tough to find for little expense. So I'm going to start out with his first album that's available, and that's this one. It's called Powerful People. It was released in 1974 on A&M Records. Gino Vannelli was only in his early 20s when he made this. I think about, only 20 years old, actually, if I recall. And he started having hits from this album. People Gotta Move being his most famous. That came out around the time where Steely Dan were really popular. And I believe he was the first Caucasian artist to appear on Soul Train, too. He performed that and the title song of this album. This is the inside of that CD. And here's a picture of Gino and his brother, Ross Vannelli. I'm sorry, Ross Vannelli's his other brother. That's his brother, Joe. And Joe Vannelli was actually responsible for the electronics of the sound. So it was sort of like having a built-in Bernie Taupin as a brother for his Elton John. Gino wrote the music, except he wrote the lyrics actually, and arranged everything, and Joe made the majority of the music. And one of the stalwarts in their band was also the drummer Graham Lear, who stayed with him throughout the 70s and into the early 80s. This is Gino Vannelli's third album, actually, called Storm at Sunup. The cover introduces Gino in his famous big 70s hair, as they called it, and open shirt look, kind of as a sex symbol. But this album, if you open it up, actually look at the back, you'll see Gino's band at the time, Joe Vannelli, Graham Lear, John J. Mandel, and Richard Baker. This album, as with all of Gino's early 70s albums, is really, really broadly and sweepingly arranged with a lot of really powerful, synthesizer and electronic progressions, and a really genre-defying interpretation of the music of the funk era. A lot of jazz, a lot of soul, a lot of electronic, very unusual songwriting and chord progressions. And not only that, but this particular album is actually a concept record about a man growing up. And Gino does a lot of intellectualizing on this. Even when he's talking about sexuality, it's very much 50-50 between the libido and the mind, and I love that. It's not just lascivious sexuality. There's definitely a mind behind this. Definitely worth a listen for a man who is going from their adolescence into adulthood. Thinking person, that is. This is Gino Vannelli, fifth album, The Gist of the Gemini, and of course he is a Gemini. I love that double image of Gino looking over the piano. I also love that photographic shot of Gino and his brother Joe. And if you open it up inside, you see the band. And there's been some changes at this point. I think it's Dido. It's not Dido. Maybe it is Dido. Not the female singer-songwriter, but a conga player. This particular album, which was released in 1976, is a bit of an Abbey Road type record in the sense that there's a medley at the end from the Battle Cry actually to Summers of My Life, which is very much about returning Vietnam vets and what we value about war, peace, and life. And it's not a pretentious progressive rock number where he is reading Tolkien or other literature. He is actually asking direct questions. On one song called Carnal Question, he actually asks, what in the world would you do if I couldn't make love to you if I came back a prisoner from the war? He's talking about things like that. And there's another song on here called New Fix for 76, where he actually talks about, people finding other alternatives to drugs in the 70s to expand their consciousness. Really wonderful and insightful album, again, in the style of his two that I just mentioned. Really very good. This is my personal favorite, Pauper in Paradise. This actually has the London Symphony Orchestra on it. The Pauper in Paradise, first, second, third, and fourth movement at the end of the album. This could almost be a movie soundtrack. The first 5 songs on it, including The Shortest Things Can Change, which was a hit, and One Night with You, which was another hit, and my two favorites, Mardi Gras and Valleys of Valhalla, because of their lovely sweeping electronics. This is the definitive Gino Vannelli experience as far as I'm concerned, because it's so cinematic. And this is actually the last album he would record in the particular style of the ones I just mentioned. This album is actually his hit record. He had a big hit single off of this album called I Just Want to Stop, and also another song called The Wheels of Life. And this opening song, Appaloosa, did pretty well. It's very much in the style of the previous 4 albums. The difference is that the instrumentation is a lot more live. They really backed away from the electronic orchestrations on this album and went for a pretty straight Latin, jazz, funk kind of album. Somewhat similar to Steely Dan's Asia. Very good way to describe this album. Much more live sounding. There's keyboards, but the arrangements aren't based on them. But it's still part of his classic period, but it's also transitional as well. I think he was really trying to get a lot of singles from this particular album. This was his first release of the 80s, and it was called Night Walker. This was released in 1981. Now, this is actually an import CD. I'm not sure what country it's from. I got it off eBay. It's not any of the Japanese versions of the original A&M CD, but this particular album featured a song called Living Inside Myself, and Nightwalker was actually a hit. This album is very much more in the contemporary soft rock tradition. The production is quite a lot slicker. It sounds more like, oops, sorry about that little shake there. Sounds very much more like a Toto record. There's more guitars in the production, less keyboards and percussion. It's more of a pop rock sort of album. And by this point, it's sort of so-so, you know. I mean, it's not terrible, but some of the quality of Gino's songwriting is getting a little obtuse, and he's getting more into the instrumentation of his music at this particular point. Anyway, in 1982, he recorded an album for A&M called Twisted Heart, which was very rock-oriented. And A&M, for whatever reason, refused to release it, and Gino Vannelli went through a several-year battle, a la George Michael or Prince, to get out of his contract. And he reemerged in 1985 with this album called Black Cars, which was his debut for CBS Records. This is a very, very typical album for the era, kind of a synth-pop new wave album, and the material all would have worked on it. The title track is really very good. But something happened. Gino changed his vocal style. He started to actually sing somewhat more like Richard Marx on this album. And he totally stopped using that very jazzy, expressive, operatic sound that he had in the 70s. Just didn't quite sound like Gino. His vocal instrument was very different, and it didn't quite have the passion of earlier works. So, a lot of fans from the 70s might not like this album, but I think that it gained him a lot of new fans. Musically speaking, this album is quite a lot better, actually. Big Dreamers Never Sleep. This was made in 1987. Here's the inside of that album. This is something of a grail, too. I mean, it's not that hard to find, but it's not that easy to find either. You know, you kind of just run around it through luck. Black Cars, even more so, I should add. That is not easy to find. It's actually on a CD, I believe, with Nightwalker these days. Anyway, this particular album has a hit on it called Wild Horses. And this album has more funk and Latin influences. Again, the trouble I have with this, as with all of Gino's post-A&M albums, is his vocal style. I don't particularly like his vocal style of this era. It's much, much too tame, and he could do a lot better, but for some reason he didn't. And it's not the 80s, because in 1990, he actually made this album called Inconsolable Man and recorded it for the BMG. And this was released in 1990. This is actually very much in the same league as Big Dreamers Never Sleep. He's got somewhat of a modern take on his jazz, funk, Latin mixture on this album as well. He programmed a lot of the electronics himself on this. But again, the passion in his voice simply is not there as much. Now, later he made a group of Spanish language albums, which I don't have, that return to his classic vocal style, but I think he still should have stayed with those. But that's my Gino Vannelli collection. Personally, I recommend these first 4 albums are absolutely ingenious, and get that too. But yeah, after that, with these, it's kind of so you can take them or leave them. But happy birthday, Gino Vannelli, and don't stop. Don't stop recording. If the music industry is in a bad place, it needs more artists like you and like Stevie Wonder. Happy birthday, Gino.